benvenuti a questa giornata. Sono padre Joseph Briffa, insegno qui al biblico archeologia e geografia biblica. È onore mio oggi di poter introdurre i nostri diversi relatori. Cominciamo stamattina con il professor Christian Frevel, come vedete anche della Ruhr-Universität Bochum in Germania. Il professor Frevel è professore di Antico Testamento nel Dipartimento di Teologia Cattolica. Ha fatto i suoi studi sia a Bonn, sia gli studi che non la tesi dottorale e anche l'abilitazione lì, ed è lì anche membro del centro di ricerca sulle religioni e insegna anche, tra varie cose, forse per motivi di interesse anche mio, anche in un programma che c'è presso il monastero della Dormizione a Gerusalemme. Appunto, eviterò di elencare un curriculum di bibliografia infinito del professor Frevel, ma sottolineo alcune delle sue pubblicazioni più recenti, proprio che vanno a toccare proprio su questo mondo qui. Appunto nel 2023 è uscita la seconda edizione della versione in inglese del suo History of Ancient Israel, che chiaramente è anche un tomo importante proprio a livello di anche come libro di testo, no? Della storia dell'antico Israele, ma anche appunto alcuni altri studi proprio pubblicati quest'anno scorso, nel 2024, tra cui per esempio cito Recent Issues in History, Can We Speak of a United Monarchy or an Independent Judah? Che è uno che è uscito nell'Oxford Handbook of the Book of Kings, così come Is It Not Samaria? Reconsidering the Centrality of Jerusalem is Yahvism in the Iron Age, appunto uscito nella rivista semitica, proprio un po' per dare un assaggio del curriculum ampio che riguarda appunto la storia dell'antico Israele e anche la storia della religione. Oggi il professor Frevel ci parlerà proprio del Biblical Text as Historical Sources, Considerations on Ancient Israel's Historiography in the Light of Archaeological Research. La relazione sarà in inglese, ma so che la traduzione in italiano è disponibile sul sito. Allora lascio proprio la parola al professor Frevel.
Per la gentile presentazione. Sono molto onorato. Passo ora all'inglese. I'm so sorry, my Italian is too bad. Since I'm happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation, and I'm glad to have 60 minutes for a 90 minutes talk, as usual. So I will cut down the manuscript and start a little bit later than your transcription or your translation is with the first point. Scusi. What are the sources of the history of ancient Israel? And we already spoke yesterday morning about this point. So I skip this idea of the 19th century as a background of history, taking us to the development of the first archaeology intro and everywhere. So construction and selection as prerequisites of what are the sources of ancient Israel. The past and the history are not the same. A history is always construction, guided by subjectivity and interests. Historiography as well. At first, this seems unintuitive because we are accustomed to understanding history as reconstruction. However, the pasts are gone, as Johann Jacob Droysen, the doyen of the historiography in the 19th century, formulated. What is past cannot become present again, no matter how much information is gathered. Therefore, it is impossible to reconstruct the past. Only construction remains. This may sound arbitrary and create discomfort, but it highlights that historiography is a process of cognition that does not simply exist. It is rather a communicative construction of the past that aims to make sense for the present and the future. This attribution of meaning is based on what is still recognizable from the past. However, the past is a black box, to which we have no direct access. We only have access to what has been directly or indirectly preserved from this past, what we call the sources of historiography. The quantitative density of sources varies greatly. Sometimes we have only a minimal excerpt, sometimes the sources are overwhelming. The conditions for the construction of historiography also include selection and combination. Take, for example, the campaign of Hazael at the end of the 9th century, mentioned in 2 Kings 12, 17 to 18. I will not read out the biblical passages. You may read it in whatever translation you want. If I refer to the text, I'm referring to the revised standard version. So there's an approximately 80 centimeters thick destruction layer from stratum A3 in Tel Safi, which dates to the end of the 9th century BC, around 830. For the reconstruction of the campaign, all destruction layers in the north and the south are relevant. It does not suffice to examine the layers of God and to point to the contemporaneous lack of destruction layer in Jerusalem. It is also necessary to consider the data from the north and the Shephelah. The cities, one mistake, the image shouldn't be there, and you should read the destruction layers of Dan, Megiddo, Yokneam, Afek, Gat, Tel Rechov, Bet Shean, Tel Amal, Tel Mikal, and other towns. They were in the south destroyed or show a distinct break. Not all data from Gad are relevant in this regard. In this case, for instance, pottery is only relevant for dating the destruction, not only so much for the destruction itself. Thus, to construct history, it is important to select the data from the incredible amount of available data. As mentioned, there is no positive evidence that it was Hazael who destroyed Gad in the last third of the 9th century, even if we lack alternatives. But let us assume that Hazael was the destroyer in this case. Why did he drive his campaign to the far south? And why may he have spared Jerusalem, as told in the biblical text? The archaeological record does not give a direct answer. Thus, there are lots of discussions on the interpretation of Hazael's campaign. Some scholars, including myself, have argued that the campaign did not aim at the political subjugation alone, but mainly to control the copper trade from the south. However, there are many uncertainties, and most recently, Piotr Biankowski has challenged the line of interpretation that was brought up originally by Israel Finkelstein and Alexander van Tarkin. Biankowski is right in emphasizing that Fayan copper was not replaced by Cypriot copper. So he is correct in challenging the suggestion that Hazael's campaign intended to give preference to Cypriot copper. On the one hand, there can be little doubt that there was Cypriot copper in the 9th century, as has been traced by lead isotope analysis performed on an ingot of Hasor. But additional evidence of Cypriot copper in this region is still small. On the other hand, there's evidence from Neveyam that 9 ingots came from Fayan area. However, at the end of the day, this is not enough evidence to conclude a complete replacement of the Fayan copper supply in Iron Age 2. So, the copper trade remains a sensible explanation as Hazael's movements, and the omission of Jerusalem is due to its minor significance in this context. But as we have seen, all hypotheses rest upon data of the archaeometallurgical lead isotope analysis, which are selected and combined to a hypothesis, which is based on data, that is not fully constructed. Incidentally, the example of the destruction layer of A3 in Telesaphi is a perfect illustration of how biblical information and archaeological data interplay. It clearly demonstrates that archaeology, and that's my point, itself requires a significant degree of interpretation and is by no means the high court of that ultimately rules on hypothesis. So the second point, primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. Regarding the Bible, there's often the qualification that it is merely a secondary source and moreover tendentious literature. That is true, but what exactly does that mean? Tendentious literature pursues a clear goal. It wants to propaganda and appeal of warning. The more the information in the text is subordinated to that objective, the less objective it gets. However, all texts are fundamentally subjective and pursue an intention. They want to convey an information, something. This is what textual pragmatic analysis does. In sum, the fact that the Bible is tendentious literature says everything and nothing. Nevertheless, the intention of the classification is clear: to cast doubt on the historical value of the Bible in favor of other sources. Classification as a secondary source is more neutral, seemingly, but only at the first glance. So, archaeology, epigraphy, and iconography are reckoned as the first primary sources, then the Bible and ancient Eastern texts or Josephus as secondary sources, and then the secondary literature as tertiary sources. So the destruction horizon, in the case of God, does not tell the courser. It does not present us, Hazael, as the destroyer. 2 Kings 12:18 mentions him as mentions the destruction of God, but no intention or context. And then the tertiary interpretation sources is the interpretation of the data in a certain direction. What is quite clear is that primary sources are not more objective or less tendentious. Dass Daten primär sind, heißt noch lange nicht, dass sie vollständig und nur repräsentativ sind, wahr sind. Es heißt lediglich, dass deren raumzeitliche Koordination bereits hypothetisch sind. The distinction between primary sources and secondary sources can be used heuristically to understand the difference. The distance to the temporal events is often argued for primary sources. It is by no means a guarantee for authenticity. No source speaks for itself. They all depend on interpretation from a historian. Both types of sources must be incorporated into a history in an equally critical and methodologically reflect manner. So, my next point is the not very productive distinction between maximalists and minimalists. Opinions differ widely on the value of Bible as historical source, for which the methodological distinction between minimalists and maximalists has prevailed since a controversy in the 1990s. It was fostered by the so-called Copenhagen School, Thomas Thompson and Niels Peter Lemke and others, who questioned the historical value of the biblical sources for a reconstruction of ancient Israel. The escalation of the debate was less a problem of historiography than a sign of a hermeneutical problem to differentiate methodologically between the historical and the theological interpretation. While the so-called minimalists include biblical texts in the reconstruction of history only if they can be reconciled with non-biblical evidence, maximalists take the Bible as a historical source as long as it cannot be refuted by extra-biblical evidence, or if it is in itself implausible. Though those categories are distorting in their sharp dichotomy, they are still heuristically helpful for determining the principal handling of the sources. Everyone agrees that the history of ancient Israel must not be allowed to dissolve into a retelling of biblical stories. For then, salvation history interpreted as God's saving action, and history as critically reflected and data-based construction of history, would be inadmissibly intermixed. However, the biblical presentation is less interested in the historical events than in their interpretation. Therefore, in the context of the history of Israel, the Bible is often referred to as Tendenzliteratur, tendentious literature. The literary term is used in different ways, but usually has a strong pejorative and derogatory meaning. It also refers to literature that is misused for religious, political, ideological, and propagandistic purposes, as well as literature that is used to secure collective identities and tends towards partially and unambiguous positioning at the expense of objectivity. On the one hand, it is true that the Bible is tendentious. It is tendentious literature in the same, in the sense of being theologically biased. But that does not necessarily mean that it is thoroughly late, ahistorical fiction, untrue. There are several examples that show that the information that the Bible provides has a high degree of possibility in individual cases. This applies, for example, to the important role of Hazor in the late Bronze Age, Joshua 11:1, to the note that the Aramean king Hazael attacked the Philistine city of Gad, 2 Kings 12:18, or to the information that Darius I accessed an archive in Ecbatana in Ezra 6:1. But even these examples show how usable information is to be found in widely different contexts. While the military conquest recounted in the book of Joshua is ahistorical, the factuality of the Second Temple's reconstruction as recounted in Ezra is historical. In the latter instance, only the historicity of the documents cited as allegedly original and their current context is to be questioned. Let us come back to our example of 2 Kings 12:19, reporting Hazael's raid against Gad and the sparing of Jerusalem. The conquest of Gad is attested by the thick layer of destruction. This would be sufficient evidence for the minimalists, although Hazael is not mentioned in any document found in the excavations of Tel Safi. And there is no other textual information on the campaign of Hazael in the south. The phrase, at that time, as in the biblical text, can be at any time during the 40 years of Jehoash. Thus, in principle, Gad may have been destroyed by any other perpetrator. But since the Bible is trustworthy, there are no doubts that Hazael's destruction of Gad, which is evidenced by archaeological excavation. Biblical and archaeological information are assumed to match. Can we hence trust the full information given in the biblical report? The biblical text mentions Hazael spared Jerusalem because Jehoash gave him lots of precious metal. For the maximalist view, this is fully true because it is mentioned in the Bible. That's it. By contrast, for the minimalist view, it is completely dubious, since it is only attested in the Bible, and since there are no other information to verify it. Using this verse as an example, it is easy to see that the extreme position of maximalism and minimalism are of little use. Rather, a historical evaluation of the information given in the biblical text is required. However, several possibilities exist to evaluate the information of 2 Kings 12:17-18. First, the biblical information is correct, and Jehoash succeeded in protecting Jerusalem by paying a bribe to Hazael. Second, the biblical text contains historical information insofar as it documents the tribute payment to Hazael that Judah had to pay after the Aramean king had turned Israel into a vassal. C, the biblical information is not correct, and Hazael dethroned Jehoash and made Amaziah king of Judah. And D, the biblical information is an invention of tradition to portray Judah as smarter than the Arameans and the north. These are only the main possibilities, and it's immediately clear that the issue is too complex for simple yes or no decisions. The background information is even more complex. The campaign of Hazael is plausible for other reasons. Hazael is trying to increase Aram's influence and control over the main trade routes, probably to control the copper trade. These trade routes do not run past Jerusalem, so he has little interest in Jerusalem. It is not unlikely that Hazael, with his imperial dominance, brought parts of the northern states, Israel, under his control. The Tel Dan stele bears witness to this. 2 Kings 13:2 evinces the vassalage only in the time of Jehoahaz. But one possibility to understand the revolution of Jehu is that it was installed by Hazael as loyal king in Samaria and as an important Aramean vassal. If this is correct, the impact on Judah had to be significant because Judah was still more or less dependent on Israel. Third, thus, a tribute of Jehoash of Judah to Hazael would be plausible. However, one must consider all the information on Joash given in 2 Kings 12. On the one hand, he is portrayed as the organizer of a temple renovation, and this seems to be a positive aspect of his reign. On the other hand, his end, narrated in 2 Kings 12:20, is dubious. I read out this passage. His servants arose, devised conspiracy, and killed Joash in the house of Millo, on the way that goes down to Silla. And then the names are given of the perpetrators of this crime. From a minimalist viewpoint, this information is again useless, since no extra biblical information exists regarding this regicide. The interesting details of the place and the agency will be addressed later in this talk. The interesting details later on. However, the successor Amaziah seems to have been installed as an Aramean vassal in Jerusalem. He attempted to get rid of the Aramean dominance, but was expelled to Lachish, where he tried to establish a counter-kingdom, 2 Kings 14:19, possibly for several decades, 2 Kings 14:17. Perhaps he aimed to uncouple the south of Judah from the Aramean dominance by the help of the Egyptian superpower and some loyal parts of Jerusalem elite. But he was killed, and Azariah became successor in Jerusalem, again a vassal of the Arameans. Things become incredibly complex if one assumes that Joash was installed by the Arameans as king of Samaria and paying his tribute. When Amaziah overestimated himself and challenged Joash, Joash took control of Judah again. That's my view of the process. Let's put aside of the complexity of interpreting the biblical information for a moment. It is imperative to realize that the reconstruction of the time of the Israelite and Judean monarchy becomes an endeavor of insurmountable difficulty. If the biblical information is not taken into account, however unreliable it may prove in matters of detail, you can't go forward. A minimalist stance, which outrightly rejects the value of these sources, fails to constitute a viable option in the historiography of ancient Israel. Conversely, a maximalist stance, which accepts all particulars, including the theological judgments presented in the Book of Kings, is unequivocally accurate scarcely represents a judicious methodology for engaging these textual sources. The biblical narrative remained imbued with a distinct narrative purpose, and the details they provide are frequently subordinate to that overarching aim. If this is accepted, the question of significance of archaeological facts once again rises with great urgency. Can archaeology determine truth? So, some breaking news. The Bible was confirmed. The relationship between Bible and extra-biblical sources is always a product of its time. The degree of historical information attributed to the Bible as a source is inversely proportional to the historical awareness and the quantity of extra-biblical sources. Such a reduction of the historical value of biblical texts follows the process of secularization. This only becomes problematic when the Bible is reduced to its historical dimension, and knowledge is expected to replace faith. This fundamental insight has significant methodological and hermeneutical implications for the treatment of the Bible, which cannot be fully elaborated in this talk. However, 3 key examples will illustrate my point. First, the Bible controversy at the beginning of the 20th century. Then, the success of Werner Keller in the mid-20th century. And finally, the debate of the role of archaeology in the beginning of the 21st century, or 50 years steps. In 1902 and 93, Friedrich Delitzsch delivered his lectures on Babel and the Bible in Berlin, in which he explored the parallels between ancient Near Eastern world and biblical narratives. Given the numerous similarities in motives, stories, and backgrounds, Delitzsch concluded that the Old Testament lacked originality and therefore was useless for the Christian faith. Later, Delitzsch even referred to the Bible as the Great Deception, arguing that this revelation could be derived from other sources. His arguments were interwoven with anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic cliches. However, the resistance against Delitzsch primarily targeted his questioning of the truth of the Bible and the Bible's claim for revelation. The great misunderstanding that only that was deducible can be true, and that only what the Bible historically reveals with precision is true, remains indelible among fundamentalists to this day. Revelation is mistakenly equated with the label historically true. Consequently, there are ongoing pseudo-battles over the reliability of the Bible. And this brings us to the next example in the mid of the 20th century. One of the most successful books of the Bible, this was Friedrich Delitzsch, and now Werner Keller. The almost most successful, more successful than the Bible itself, was the non-fiction German book of the journalist Werner Keller, which was published in 1955 under the title Und die Bibel hat doch recht, and afterwards translated into many languages, the English title, The Bible as History, and the Italian title, La Bibbia aveva ragione. The book presented archaeological facts and proved the truth of the Bible. The book pointed at the Mesopotamian parallel accounts of the biblical flood story, the other way around than Delitzsch, and related this to a mud layer discovered in Ruhr as a proof of the biblical account. Or the white drop-shaped secretion of lice on tamarisk trees proved that the story of the manna in the desert is true. By means of scientific explanation or pseudo-scientific explanations and archaeological findings, Keller believed he had transformed myth into history and proven the truth of the Bible. And if these incredible miracle stories are true, how much more are the historical accounts? Keller misunderstood the Bible as a book of facts and did not pay the slightest attention to his narrative intentions. At the same time, he misunderstood the task of archaeology because he reduced it to the function of proving the truth of revelation. On balance, the book has probably done more harm in the wake of secularization than good, because it confirmed the false expectation that the Bible reports facts. And if these do not correspond to historical facts, the Bible becomes worthless. The truth of the Bible is not the accordance to everyday history, but the testimony of faith, and that this story is divinely wrought and divinely guided. The third example in the 21st century seems also belonging to the aftermath of the mentioned debates, although the protagonists are academics far beyond any fundamentalism. This concerns the role of archaeology, which at the beginning of the third millennium was characterized in biblical scholarship by scientific precision, saw an exponential increase of data, and gained an extreme sociological elevation within the scientific community. This stood in contrast to the late dating of most historical texts of the Old Testament, which thereby lacked eyewitness accounts. Consequently, the weight attributed to the respective sources shifted. Archaeology was elevated to the status of exact science, while biblical scholarship was relegated to a fairy tale, and a fairy tale forest, whose historicity in many cases proved to be more than questionable in the face of archaeological judgment. In 2010, almost 15 years ago, a discussion took place between Nadav Naaman, David Ushishkin, and Israel Finkelstein, all three from Tel Aviv University, and often but not always on the same side. Nadav Naaman, a historian by education, questioned the accurateness of archaeological sciences and asked whether archaeological data should really be the high court in whose decisions historical truth can be expected. He challenged a quote of David Ushishkin, where he said that archaeological information should take preference over the Bible. With several examples, he challenged the exactness of information and hence the priority of archaeology over historical and biblical information. Naaman concluded that exclusive reliance on one of them alone can produce a distorted picture. Only the skillful use of both can lead to balanced evaluation of the ancient reality. In his rejoinder, Israel Finkelstein pointed to the criteria of selection and the rules of comparison. He was right in doing so. And at the end, he sided with Ushishkin by stating, "Yet when the solid data from well-excavated sites is compared to assumptions regarding the nature of biblical texts and their date of compilation, the former should prevail." So preference prevail. Labeling the data as solid suggests authenticity, while the Bible is dependent on its time of origin. This essentially revives the evaluative differentiation between primary and secondary sources, which was dismissed already above, as primary sources require also interpretation. No matter how precise a destruction layer in an excavation may be, it rarely provides information about the perpetrator. Moreover, the significant gap between the time of a text creation and the period it describes does not inherently exclude historicity. So, one example in between, and then we come back to this discussion, or two examples. Joshua 11:11 is one of the simplest examples. Joshua turned back at that time and took Hazor. It is true that Hazor experienced significant destruction following a period of decline during the late Bronze Age. The destruction occurred in the late 13th to early 12th century and the involvement of Joshua is a subject of debate time and again. However, it is highly improbable that the Israelites, whoever that may be in the 12th century, were responsible for the initial collapse of southern Levantine cities. Nevertheless, the assertion of the vast city of Hazor was the leading city-state among the Canaanite city-states in the late Bronze Age is credible, even though this information was recorded approximately 5 centuries later. Naaman is right when he demands a balanced evaluation of the sources without prejudice. One cannot escape the contradictions between the interpretation drawn from the archaeological data and the biblical account. One must deal with them and decide after discussing all the details. The last point is fairly undisputed, and as long as it concerns positive evidence. However, the situation becomes much more challenging when it involves the absence of positive evidence and when interpretation is needed. This is also a key issue in the debate about the relationship between archaeology and Bible. The lack of evidence is often used for the contestation of biblical details. If there is no evidence of building activity in Gezer, Megiddo, Hazor in the 10th century, then 1 Kings 9:15 is not true, since it relates Solomon's fortifications to these cities. While this example, due to a multitude of data and coincidences, the chronology of building layers, absence of functioning state in Judah during the Iron Age 2a, indeed leads to considering that 1 Kings 9:15 is a later projection. There are more complex examples that are not as clear-cut. Let us come back to our intricate story of Joash by giving the second example. If there is no evidence of a city wall in Jerusalem before the late Iron Age 2 Kings 14:13 cannot hold water. The passage reads, that was Solomon, the passage reads that he came to Jerusalem and broke down the wall of Jerusalem from the Ephraim gate to the corner gate. A distance of 400 cubits is said in the biblical text. The Nimshite king Jehoash and Amaziah ruled in the transition between the 9th and the 8th century BCE. As was mentioned above, it is unclear whether King Jehoash of Israel is the same king that was replaced by Hazael in 2 Kings 12:16, or who was made king by Hazael in Samaria after the defeat of Jehoahaz in 2 Kings 13:3-8. Amaziah, however, is the Judean loudmouth who thinks he is standing up to Joash of Samaria and has made a bitter mistake. At any rate, the battle in Bet-Shemesh abruptly thwarts his ambitions to defeat the north. Amaziah is not killed, however, but merely captured and strikingly taken back to the place of his reign and rule there the full of 15 years after the death of Joash of Samaria. This only makes political sense if Amaziah agreed to give up all ambitions for the time being and paid tribute to Joash. This is indeed hinted at 2 Kings 14:14 in verting agency as from a Judean bias perspective, when Joash plunders the temple treasury and takes hostages. He seized all the gold and silver and all the vessels that were found in the house of the Lord and the treasures of the kings, as well as hostages, he returned to Samaria. However, before Joash can pull off his coup, he apparently has to overcome the resistance of the Elites in Jerusalem and to attack Jerusalem with military force. The biblical text says that Joash tore down the walls of Jerusalem from the Ephraim gate to the corner gate, a distance of 100 cubits. We do not exactly know the position of the mentioned gates, but most probably location is the western expansion of the city, the so-called Broad Wall, excavated already 1970 from Nachman Avigal. It's a stretch of 65 meters in the Jewish quarter of a massive 7-meter broad wall. The wall was originally dated to the 8th century and attributed to Hezekiah. It aimed at securing the expansion of the city, which began under Ahaz. In the most recent report, published in April 2024, this wall was redated by radiocarbon probes some years earlier to the king of Azariah, who reigned from 787 to 773. This is close to the reign of Joash and the battle with Amaziah, but still comes decades later. But the gap is narrowing. Nonetheless, the city was not fortified in former times. The city of Jerusalem in the Iron Age too was allegedly unfortified, and the first surrounding wall in the southeastern part is archaeologically dated to the mid of the 8th century. The newest radiocarbon dates indicate, I quote, the building of a mid-slope fortification and a retaining wall along the eastern slope of the southeastern ridge under King Uzziah around 760, but not earlier. Particularly, the reference to the Ephraim Gate that may have located close to Hezekiah's broad wall raises the question whether 2 Kings 14:13 is a reprojection from later times. Even if one accepts that the wall is built already in the middle of the 8th century, the narrated event concerning Joash is too early for that wall. So can archaeology decide how historically true the events reported in 2 Kings 14 are? That would be too far for the archaeological record. Naaman questioned in the discussion I mentioned the too easy conclusion with a well-known aphorism attributed by the astronomer Carl Sagan, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, often quoted as absence of proof is not proof of absence. That is to say that lacking evidence of something does not exclude its existence. Logically, this is inescapable. Though it should not be overlooked that the context plays a central role. If there were no monumental buildings from the 10th century throughout Judah, as was certainly the case before Eilat Mazar's excavation in Jerusalem, the assumption of a Solomonic empire encompassing Judah would be highly doubtful. However, negative evidence can never definitely exclude the existence of Solomon. A good example here would be David, who first entered the realm of extra-biblical attestation with the discovery of the Tel Dan stele. The Tel Dan stele, after centuries of absence, even though it remains unclear to what spatial and temporal extent the Beit David actually refers. Naaman is right to emphasize that there is a particular bias in biblical archaeology that is in danger to give absolute priority to archaeological evidence or non-evidence, which is methodologically wrong. One of his telling examples is the strong presence of Abdi-Cheba, the ruler of Jerusalem, the Amarna correspondence. In stark contrast, Jerusalem is of little significance in archaeological and infrastructural terms. As both are so-called primary sources, the dilemma is evident. In sum, archaeology is not the high court, but must be listened to. In principle, this seems to be the necessary methodological conclusion. However, there are certainly cases in which archaeology plays a decisive role. Let's turn to our example of the broken wall. The mentioned wall of 2 Kings 14:13 is still a riddle. We can see the change in dealing with negative evidence with reference to the wall mentioned in 2 Kings 14:13. In his rejoinder, Nadav Naaman, Israel Finkelstein wrote in 2011, years later, the discrepancy between the existence of Judahite fortification in the late Iron Age II cities and the absence of such fortifications in the city of David is yet to be resolved, but not by arguing that the Iron 2B city walls was erected in 800 BCE. Although he does not explicitly say so, he seems to be of the opinion that there is no proof of a fortification that can be related to 2 Kings 14:13. However, in a more recent publication, 2023, in which he discusses the building activity of the Iron Age II, expanding the settlement on the Temple Mount to the city of David Ridge, Israel Finkelstein now fully agrees with Nadav and Naaman. He writes, Together, they seem to represent the first expansion from the Mount of the Temple Mount toward the spring. There is no indication for fortification in this new sector of the city. And then, judging from central Judahite towns in the Shephelah and the Beersheba Valley, and from the clue in the chronistic verse of 2 Kings 14:13, the mount itself must have been fortified. 2 Kings 14:13 is a kind of shibboleth and divides opinion. It is generally assumed that Jerusalem was walled in the Iron Age II, because the Bible says so. The passage is then read as a report. For instance, Klaus Bieberstein, Nadav Naaman, Stephen Mackenzie, and many others. The only argument in favor is not hard evidence, but analogy. Lachish, Beersheba, Arad were fortified contemporaneously with walls. The fact that this wall has not yet been archaeologically proven is then merely a not yet, and not an evidence of absence. However, given the density of excavations in Jerusalem, and look at this density of excavations, it must be asked whether there is still a chance of proving the existence of this Iron Age II wall. The argument that the Haram makes the proof impossible is more of a protective claim than a real argument. Because archaeological evidence would be more likely in the south and the west of the Acropolis, it is a protective argument. Again, Israel Finkelstein, yet there had been an early 8th century, if not earlier, wall in the west. It should also be found on the eastern slope, which has been thoroughly explored in the course of many excavations. And it was not. There is none. Thus, it seems that archaeology rules indeed on this case after centuries of excavations. The Bible is not about historical truth, and we are coming to the point that what is the use of the Bible in this discussion? My final methodological observation emphasizes that the binary categorization of biblical sources as simply false or true is fundamentally inadequate and for their proper treatment. Such an approach strips these texts of their essential character as theological compositions. The biblical texts aim not merely to recount history, but to interpret and to explain it through the lens of their faith and that of the transmitting community. However, the interpretative and theological dimensions of these texts are not self-evident. They emerge only when considered against the backdrop of the secular historical progressions of events. It is only by discerning what the biblical text adds or omits that we can grasp the intended message. At times, one encounters the perspective that the historical credibility of these texts is irrelevant, with narratological concerns alone driving the analysis. While it is true that the text functions as an independent narratives, generating meaning through their structure and storytelling, their theological message becomes truly comprehensible only when their perspective is critically assessed in relation to the historical processes. Let us take the striking disorder of political institutions in the North as an example. The biblical portrayal is fail, inability, chaos, usurpation, revolt, regicide, all the way through, but particularly in the 8th century BCE. The purpose of this is to smear the northern state and its legitimacy in general, thereby explaining its demise in 722. This tendency was even more strengthened in the Persian brotherly antagonism between the Sumerians on Mount Gerizim and the Judeans in Jerusalem. The intention of the text is not to present an historically accurate account, but rather to blame the northerners. It is biased and interested in the instability of the northern kingdom in contrast with the Davidic continuity, which is also by no means historically accurate. Only meager glimpses of historical details are given by the biblical account. The single reports are linked very much with each other in terms of keywords, phrases, geography, and particular details, quotes, and intertextual references. They form a continuous narrative of depravity, instability, and immorality. This portrayal is not interested in historical correctness, but instead distorts the political history of Samaria deliberately. However, this is not pure invention of fairy tales. It is related to actual events, exaggerated, distorted, and sometimes wrong, but not completely detached from them. It is always noticeable that biblical text is very poor in historical details. Sometimes they are completely missing. This should not be seen as a complaint, but rather as a clear indication that the purpose of the text does not lie in historical depiction alone. The tendency of depiction can often be recognized even more clearly by comparing it with the chronicler's account. 1 Kings 15:16, for example, certainly does not reflect the historical situation. There was always war between Asa and the king of Baasha, king of Israel, in these times. It seems particularly not true in the sense of historical accurateness that Asa paid the Aramean Ben-Hadad to fend off pressure from Baasha. There are good reasons to assume that the Aramean king Ben-Hadad in 1 Kings 15 was copied and adapted from 2 Kings 13:3, 24, 25. The territorial gains that are then attributed to Ben-Hadad in the north, that is Dan, Abel Bet Macha, Tel Abel Bet Macha, and others, the whole of the Kinneret and the whole of Naphtali are probably also a backward projection from the time of Hazael in the 9th century. If this holds water, the example is a very good illustration of the construction principles of historiography. To draw a certain judgment and tendency is not a question of historical precision, but of taking set pieces from sources that do not necessarily have to fit the time. This can also be demonstrated by the notes of despoliation or the bribe with treasures in the Book of Kings, which bring our examples of Joash and Asa together. There are a whole series of similar notes in which reference is made to the temple treasures and the treasures of the palace in Judah. Of course, it is not possible to go into the necessary depth here. It is sufficient to look at these 3 passages. Access to the temple treasury and the palace treasuries in situation of distress seems to be standardized in historiography. It follows various patterns and the texts are additionally harmonized. This does not rule out the possibility that these are historical notes, but it does make it clear that the use of such standardized notes is more a means of historical representation. From a methodological point of view, this means that individual analyses are necessary, which, as mentioned above, can also be led to the assessment that the passages are not historically true. It is noticeable, for example, that 2 Kings 12 construes a list from Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, Ahaziah to Jehoram. Their gift to the temple is not mentioned elsewhere in the Book of Kings, which is significant in relation to other passages mentioning the treasury of the temple and the palace. The most interesting observation is the use of the lexeme HaKodashim, the holy things, which is translated in the NRSV with votive gifts, which is used twice in 2 Kings 12, but in no other passages in the Book of Kings. Usually, the term HaKodashim denotes the holy gifts used in the cultus offerings in the post-exilic traditions, but not parts of the temple treasure. The term may be influenced by 2 Kings 12, 5-6, where HaKodashim is all the income of the priests, which shall be used for the renovation of the temple. By the way, the use of the unusual term in the Joash inscription in line 6 is one of the reasons that this inscription is a forgery. It seems that the literary composition of 2 Kings 12 is influenced not only by Deuteronomistic, but also by the priestly tradition. So I end up with remarks on historiography beyond factuality and fictionality. And I'm sorry, it becomes a little bit more complicated. Let me add on one final remark. Until this final paragraph, it should anyway become clear how little progress can be made with diametric oppositions. Biblical texts are narratives, not history. But that does not make them unhistorical. They follow, like any other narrative, narrative principles, and can therefore also be analyzed from the methodological viewpoint of narratology. This is not unknown in Rome, I know. Their relationship to history is often fictional, meaning they are fictional narratives. However, fictionality and representation of history are not mutually exclusive. But historiographical narration cannot do without fictionality. The account in 2 Kings 12, where Joash places a chest at the temple entrance to collect money for the temple renovations, may well be a well-crafted story. It might draw on models from ancient Near Eastern narratives of the Babylonians and Achaemenides, and could serve, among other things, the narrative purpose of involving the entire people in the care, or more pragmatically, the financial maintenance of the temple. From Elephantini, a donation list from the 5th century survives, meticulously detailing the contributions of 128 individuals to the temple and how these funds were allocated among the 3 deities, Yahweh, Anad Yahweh, and Ashim Bethel. As is often assumed, the narrative in 2 Kings 12 may have connections to royal history, but such connections are not necessary. Fictional and fictitious are not the same. A narrative is fictional in itself, although it is possible that the reference with the narrative is factual at the same time. The references in these texts are neither freely invented nor designed or deceived. Rather, they derive their plausibility from the factual reality of the world they describe. However, not all historiography is historical. The apt differentiation between story and history holds much truth. The fictional nature of the narrated events does not diminish the significance of what is being narrated. The truth of the text lies beyond its factuality. However, there's agreement that the contrast between the factual and fictional is not really expedient for historiography. Historiographical texts often are hybrids between factual and fictional narratives. The task of exegesis is to take the markers of fictionality in a text seriously and to analyze them, thereby rendering the text usable for historiographical evaluation. I'm convinced that engaging with fictional text does not lead to a loss of connection with reality. Even the most fictional text retains some reference to what we call the past. So, the summary. A fundamental premise in comprehending biblical historiography is the recognition and acknowledgement that it does not constitute a factual recounting of events. The presumption that the events transpired precisely as depicted in the biblical text is simplistic and contradicts a basic understanding of narrative literature. This raises questions regarding the historicity and the historical reliability of these texts. How should we address the reality that the Bible contains more fiction than fact? Certain methodological stances reject any historical truth value in the Bible, which is an overly dismissive approach. Biblical historiography is not rendered useless by its failure to accurately depict events and historical sequences. Indeed, it sometimes even contradicts them. We have demonstrated that the relationship between biblical historiography and archaeological evidence is far more intricate than the antagonistic dichotomy that suggests only one can be valid at a time. Both biblical texts and archaeological data require interpretation. These sources must be critically related to each other, with the aim not to reconcile them, but to understand each in its intrinsic value, message, and tendency. The debate between maximalist and minimalist approaches oversimplifies the complexities of historical reconstruction. Neither approach in isolation leads to a responsible history of ancient Israel. Archaeological evidence, while providing valuable material in context, also presents interpretative challenges. It's neither an ultimate arbitrary historical truth nor a fully objective source, as it necessitates contextualization and theoretical frameworks for analysis. Regarding the source value of biblical texts, we have emphasized that exegesis can achieve more than merely distinguishing between true and false. The texts possess a theological bias, with narrative details often subordinated to overarching theological aims. To fully appreciate their contribution, one must evaluate their interpretative and theological dimensions within the context of historical processes. In summary, we posit that the biblical text remains indispensable for understanding the history of ancient Israel, as they offer a unique insights otherwise unattainable. However, this is contingent upon their analysis through methodologically controlled exegesis and their consideration alongside secular historical reconstruction, incorporating all available sources. Ultimately, my lecture advocates for a balanced methodology that integrates textual and archaeological sources without privileging one over the other. Such an approach acknowledges the theological nature of biblical text, while critically engaging with archaeological evidence to construct a nuanced and understanding of ancient Israel's history. This synthesis not only enhances historical accuracy, but also respects the distinct purposes of the sources involved. Grazie per tua attenzione.